The baby's cry suddenly stops in the freezing mountain night. At the exact moment rain starts dripping onto Quang and Linda's last money. If Quang makes one wrong move, he could lose the warmth his newborn needs to breathe, and the little they have to survive tomorrow. Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we'll follow how Quang fights the cold, fixes a leaking roof, and brings home dry wood, while Linda, still weak after birth, holds their baby through the hardest hours. If you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. Rain came in thin, stubborn sheets, quiet enough that the house seemed to listen to it. Quang woke to the baby's cry turning strange, short, tired bursts that suddenly stopped. He sat up fast, cold snapping him awake. The thatched ceiling shifted softly with each gust. The baby lay in the borrowed cradle near the bed, wrapped in a blanket that had been warm yesterday. Quang leaned over, close enough to feel the baby's breath. He slid 2 fingers to the baby's neck, gentle, practiced. For one beat, he felt nothing but his own pulse. "Hey," he whispered, "come on." Then the baby's chest rose. A small sound returned, thin but real. Quang let out a slow breath. Behind him, Linda moved. She turned carefully, one hand bracing her body the way she had since the birth. "What happened?" she asked. "He went quiet," Quang said. He didn't add anything else. Linda's eyes were already on the baby. A soft tapping started near the window. Quang looked toward the corner and saw water sliding down the inside of the stone wall in a narrow line. Drops fell, tack, tack, until one landed on the edge of their cloth bag. It held their few bills and papers. Quang kept the baby close with one arm and reached down with the other, dragging the bag away from the drip. The cloth was already dark in spots. He lifted it to the highest shelf they'd built from 2 boards and bricks, then pushed it back as far as it could go. Linda sat up slowly, wincing. "Is he okay?" "He's cold," Quang said. "Not sick, just cold." Linda nodded once and handed him the small knitted cap. Her fingers were careful, like every movement cost her. Quang eased the cap onto the baby's head, then tucked the blanket tighter and held him against his chest under his shirt. The baby's fist grabbed his collar, and Quang let that tiny grip steady him. He crouched by the metal stove. Their fire was ash. Their woodpile looked rinsed. Quang picked through it, choosing the driest splinters he could find. He struck a match and shielded it with his body. The flame flickered, fought, then caught. A small fire took shape. He set a pot on the stove with a little water and the last slice of ginger he'd saved. The smell rose fast, sharp and warm. Linda watched from the bed, eyes tracking his hands. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I did," Quang lied softly. She lifted her chin toward the leak. "That's getting worse." "I'll stop it," Quang said, sliding the old chair under the wet patch. Linda's voice sharpened. "Don't!" He paused, then set the baby into Linda's arms anyway. Slow, careful, because he needed both hands. The baby settled against Linda's chest. Linda lowered her face to the baby's head, eyes closing for a second. When she opened them, she looked straight at Quang. "Be smart," she said. Quang climbed onto the chair with a piece of plastic and a sackcloth sheet. He reached up, trying to wedge the plastic under the thatch where the water came through. A gust hit the roof. The chair leg slid on damp dirt. Quang tried to step down, but his foot slipped. He hit the ground hard, shoulder and hip landing in the mud by the door. No shout, just a sharp sound of breath leaving him. Linda made a small noise, but she didn't stand. She held the baby tighter. Quang lay still for a moment, then pushed up. Pain flared along his palm where it scraped stone. "I'm okay," he said quickly. His hand was cut, thin red filling the line. He wrapped it with cloth from his shirt. Linda's eyes stayed on him. "Quang, I'm here," he said. "I'm fine." He shoved the chair aside. No more climbing tonight. He used a stick to press the plastic into place from below, wedging it tighter where he could reach. The dripping slowed and shifted away from the bedding. The kettle began to whisper. Quang poured the ginger water into a cup and brought it to Linda with both hands. "Small sips," he said. Linda drank. After 2 sips, she looked at his wrapped hand. "That hurts." "It's something," Quang admitted, "but it'll close." Linda reached out carefully and touched his wrist, light as a question. The touch steadied him. The baby stirred and made a wet sound in his throat. Quang's shoulders went rigid. He took the baby upright against his chest and patted his back with slow, gentle taps. The baby let out a quiet burp, then relaxed again. Linda exhaled. "I hate when he sounds like that." "Me too," Quang said, "but he's okay." Outside, the rain thinned. Dawn began to lighten the window, turning the darkness into a cold gray. The room still felt fragile. Quang looked at their wood pile and didn't like what he saw. "I'm going to get dry wood," he said. Linda's eyes widened. "Now?" "Before it's gone," Quang said. He knelt in front of her. "You stay close to the fire. You don't stand up fast. If you feel dizzy, you sit on the floor." Linda gave him a tired look. I know, Quang said. His voice softened. "I'm still scared." Linda's expression eased. She looked down at their baby, then back at Quang. "Be careful," she said. Quang nodded. He pulled on his jacket, tightened the cloth around his hand, and stepped toward the door. Linda shifted on the mattress as if she meant to follow him. The movement was small, but Quang saw her face change, the brief, blank look that came before the world tilted. "Linda," he said, and was at her side in 2 steps. "I'm fine," she started, but her knees softened. Quang caught her elbow and guided her down, not back onto the bed, but onto the floor near the stove where she could lean against the wall. He slid a folded blanket behind her shoulders, then settled the baby into the crook of her arm again, making sure the tiny head was supported. "Just sit," he said. 2 minutes. Breathe." Linda took a breath, then another, slower. Her hand found his wrist and squeezed once, an apology without words. Quang moved the damp bedding farther from the leak and propped it closer to the heat, then checked the shelf again, pushing the bag even deeper into the dry corner. Before he left, he came back and touched Linda's shoulder once. Quang opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying wet earth and distant wood smoke. He stepped outside into the gray morning and closed the door gently behind him, leaving Linda and the baby in the soft crackle of the small fire. Quang followed the muddy path down from their cottage with the cold air biting through his jacket. The village was awake, smoke lifting low, a gate creaking, footsteps on packed earth. Mist sat over the terrace fields. His shoes sank and pulled free. Each swing of his arm tugged at the wrapped cut on his palm, so he kept his pace careful. Get warmth. Go home. Near the first houses, a woman passed him with a basket on her back. Her eyes landed on his bandage. "You're the new one," she said. "Yes," Quang answered. "And there's a baby?" Her tone made it sound like a question and a warning. "Yes," he said again. She looked toward the slope, then back at him. "Keep him out of wind," she said, and walked on. Quang kept going until he reached a yard with a lean-to and a stack of wood tucked neatly under it. A man stood there splitting logs, the axe rising and falling with a steady rhythm. Quang stopped at the edge of the yard. "Excuse me." The man finished a split before he turned. His eyes were calm, weighing Quang without hurry. "I need dry wood," Quang said. "Just enough for today. I can pay or I can work." The man's mouth moved like he almost smiled. "Work," he repeated. "My wife gave birth recently," Quang said. "The baby got cold last night." That changed something. Not softness exactly, but attention. The man pointed at a pile of wet branches near the fence. "Drag those under the roof. Split what can be split. Stack it clean. If it looks right, you take a bundle." Quang nodded. "Thank you." The branches were heavier than they looked, soaked and slick. He dragged them under the lean-to, mud climbing his shoes. He sorted quickly, then set a few pieces on the block. His injured hand complained when he gripped the axe, so he shifted the handle into his good hand and let the weight of the blade do the work. The first crack sounded sharp in the damp air. Heat spread through his chest from the effort. He didn't count time. He only watched the pile turn into order. Split wood stacked straight, wet pieces pushed aside, the ground swept with a branch so it didn't look careless. When he stepped back, breathing hard, the man checked the stack with one glance. He disappeared inside and returned with a small bundle of dry sticks tied with twine. He set it down, then added a folded piece of old plastic, stiff and cloudy. "For your roof," he said. "It won't fix everything." Quang's throat tightened. "I'll pay for that." The man shook his head once. "Save it. Don't waste what I gave." Quang bowed his head. "I won't." He walked back up the slope with the wood held tight to his chest and the plastic tucked under his arm. His breath came harder going uphill, and his hand pulsed under the cloth, but each step felt lighter than the walk down. Now he had something real. At the door, he knocked softly and pushed it open with care. Warmth met him first, the kind from a small fire, but enough to change the air. Linda sat on the floor near the stove, wrapped in a blanket, her back against the stone wall. The baby slept against her chest, cheek pressed into her shirt. She looked up, and relief crossed her face before she could hide it. "You're back." "I'm back," Quang said. He shut the door gently and set the wood down beside the stove. He fed the fire a few dry sticks. The flame caught fast, brighter than before. He crouched beside Linda. "How are you?" Linda hesitated, then told the truth. "I got dizzy, but I stayed down." Quang's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed soft. "Good. You did exactly what you should." Her eyes dropped to his hand. "And you?" "It's nothing," he said, and the way she looked at him made him add quieter. "It stings." He held up the folded plastic. "They gave this for the roof." Linda's brows lifted. "They helped you?" "One man did," Quang said, "after he watched me work." Linda let out a tired breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "That's fair." Quang reached for the baby with both hands, slow and careful. Linda eased him over. The baby's body was warm now, heavy in that small way that made Quang's heart soften and tighten at once. He held the baby upright against his chest and listened, even though the breathing felt steady. A small wet sound came from the baby's throat, then a short, hiccup-like cough. Quang froze. Linda watched his face. "Is he okay?" Quang didn't answer right away. He adjusted the baby higher and patted the tiny back with gentle taps. The baby squirmed once, then released a quiet burp and melted into Quang's chest. Quang exhaled slowly. "Swallowed air," he said. "He's okay." Linda's shoulders dropped. "You scared me." "I scare myself," Quang admitted. He looked down at the baby's cap. "I just try not to hand it to you." Then Linda reached out and touched his forearm, careful around the wrap. "Don't keep it all," she said. "I'm here." Quang nodded and set the baby back into Linda's arms, tucking the blanket under the chin and checking the tiny hands. He poured hot water into a cup and slid in a piece of ginger he'd saved. "Small sips," he said. holding it to her. Linda drank. Some color returned to her lips, and Quang felt his chest loosen by a fraction. He rinsed a handful of rice in the pot and set it to simmer into thin porridge, stirring slowly so it wouldn't stick. The smell was plain and comforting, like something that promised the day could continue. When it cooled, he brought Linda a small bowl. Just a little. Linda ate slowly. Between bites, she watched him stack the wood neatly, then smooth the folded plastic on the table with his palm, as if flattening a stubborn worry. "You're shaking," Linda said softly. Quang glanced down. His wrapped hand trembled, small and stubborn. He tucked it under his thigh to steady it and let the silence sit for a beat. "I thought I heard nothing," he said, voice low, for a second. Linda didn't ask him to explain. She leaned her head onto his shoulder instead, careful, and the baby slept between them, warm and safe. Quang stayed still, letting the crackle of the fire fill the room. Outside, the rain had softened into light tapping, no longer urgent. Inside, his fear didn't disappear, but it settled into something he could carry without dropping anyone. After a while, Linda lifted her head and met his eyes. "Thank you," she said. Quang shook his head once. "We're doing it," he said, like a reminder. He kissed her hair, quick, simple, then added one more stick to the fire and sat back down beside her, close enough that their knees touched, watching the baby's steady breathing until the warmth in the room felt real.
Cắt da của vùng cao, Linda lủi thủi một mình trên nương sắn, quanh quẩn với đàn gà, đàn vịt, căn nhà sàn cũ kỹ. Lòng lúc nào cũng thấy cô đơn, mặc cảm và bị cảm giác bị bỏ rơi. Đúng lúc đó Quang trở về, lo lắng dặn cô không được đi vào những nơi vực sâu nguy hiểm và hứa sẽ bù đắp cho những thiếu thốn của cô. Vài ngày sau, Quang cùng người khiêng lên một chiếc tủ gỗ lớn, chắc chắn đặt giữa căn nhà sàn, giúp Linda lần đầu được treo gọn quần áo, chăn màn như một người thực sự có nhà. Anh xin nghỉ làm ở lại chăm sóc, cùng nấu ăn với cô, chế củi, trò chuyện mỗi tối. Chiếc tủ mới dần trở thành biểu tượng cho tương lai vững chắc và sợi dây gắn kết âm thầm giữa hai người. Mọi người hãy like, share và subscribe để ủng hộ giúp mình nhé.